Today I'm going to talk about Is the 5-second rule a myth? Investigating mold growth on dropped food by me and Sierra. Hypothesis. We think that bread that is dropped on the floor will begin to collect bacteria and germs immediately, and the longer it stays on the ground, the more contaminated it will become. We think bread that is left on the floor for longer periods of time, such as 30 minutes and 1 hour, will grow more visible mold than bread that is picked up quickly or not dropped at all. We also think that bread stored in a jar that is slightly open will grow more mold and show more contamination than bread stored in a completely closed jar, because air, moisture, and bacteria can enter the open jar more easily. Overall, we think that food picked up quickly is not as safe as people believe, and the 5-second rule may not be true. Our big question: how does the amount of time bread stays on the floor affect mold growth and contamination? And how does storage in open versus closed jars change the result? The materials we use for the experiment: bread, gloves, a timer, the floor, a few jars, and a sharpie and tape for the labels. Our research: eating food dropped on the floor often causes no harm, but it carries a risk of consuming bacteria or viruses, potentially leading to food poisoning. One of the effects are neurological cognitive effects. Cutting edge animal studies demonstrate that inhaling mold spores, even non toxic ones, can trigger innate immune activation in the brain, leading to memory defects, anxiety like behavior, and increased pain sensitivity. Our procedure: Step 1: we cut the bread into equal pieces. Step 2: we drop the bread on the floor. Step 3: we set a timer for the amount of time. We did 5 seconds, 30 seconds, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and 30 minutes, and 1 hour. Step 4: we pick up the bread and put it in a jar. Step 5: we let the jar sit in a warm, moist place for a few weeks. Step 6: you have mold. And now it's time to answer the big question. The amount of time bread stays on the floor affects mold growth and contamination because longer contact generally allows more bacteria and mold to transfer. In our experiment, bread left on the floor for 30 minutes and 1 hour developed the most visible molds, while the 5-second sample sometimes showed small amounts. Interestingly, the 10-minute sample did not develop molds, showing that contamination is not always predictable and can depend on other factors such as differences in moisture. Storage in open versus closed jars also affect the results, but not in a simple way. Bread stored in jars that were fully closed generally grew mold more slowly, while bread in jars that were slightly open sometimes grew mold faster because of increased exposure to air and spores. However, in our experiment, the bread that was not dropped at all and was stored in a slightly open jar did not grow mold, which shows that just being exposed to air is not enough for contamination. Contact with a contaminated surface or existing spores is also needed. Conclusion: in conclusion, our experiment showed that the amount of time bread stays on the floor does affect mold growth and contamination, but not always in a perfect, predictable way. The bread left on the floor for 30 minutes and 1 hour grew the most visible mold, while the 5 seconds and 30-second samples also showed contamination. However, the 10-minute sample did not grow mold, which shows that factors like moisture and where the bread lands can also affect results. Storage conditions also made a difference. The bread that was not dropped at all, both the one stored in a slightly open jar and the one in a fully closed jar, did not grow mold. This suggests that simply being exposed to air is not enough to cause contamination, and that contact with the floor played a major role. what we learned. From this experiment, we learned that the 5-second rule is a myth because even very short contact with the floor can transform bacteria and start mold growth. We also learned that longer contact with the floor generally increases contamination, but it is not always predictable. Factors like floor cleanliness, how the bread lands, it's the moisture that can affect the results. We discovered that how food is stored after being dropped makes a difference. Bread stored in fully closed jars grew more mold slowly, while slightly open jars allowed faster mold growth. However, undropped bread in slightly open jars did not grow mold, which shows which showed us that air exposure alone is not enough. Food must first come into contact with bacteria or spores. Overall, we learned that both floor contacts and storage conditions affect food safety. Proper handling, cleaning surfaces, and sealing food are important to reduce the risk of contamination. This experiment helped us understand how quickly germs can spread and why it's important to make careful choices about what we eat. Thank you for listening to our presentation.